wanting to experience more, and knowing that we're not meant to do this alone.
Welcome everyone to Chronicles of the High-Powered Female CEO. This is episode 17. We're rolling along, which is very exciting, and I'm so excited today to introduce you to my new friend, Bessi. Welcome, Bessi.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
And where are you tuning in from?
Melbourne, Australia. So it's the next day for me.
6:30. Isn't that amazing? And so, Bessi, let's just dive in. Tell us about who you are and how people typically know you.
Sure. There's probably, some common words that come to mind if you were looking at those titles or, the boxes you get put in for me. So I'm definitely in the serial entrepreneur category. I love that early stage of conceptualizing something, kicking open doors and building things. So I've done that multiple times over and built 7-figure businesses that really the common theme in all of those has been my passion to bring doing good and making money back together. So I find people tend to very much, even when they say they don't, they separate those out. Are you running a business that's all about profit, or are you going into a non-profit or a charity or government work? So my passion has always been to bring those things back together. So that's looked, a number of different ways, but it's been the common theme from everything. Like I started an incubator for social enterprises many years ago to actually help them build up the sustainable business model so they could do good and make money in the world and not just rely on donations and hope that the fact they were trying to do good meant people would support them. And in that business, what was really exciting was to see that where everybody said, and even now if you look at incubators around the world that are working with organizations, they're telling those they work with to have a sustainable business model, but they don't have one, which always bugged me because I'm someone who's like, I will listen to a practitioner. So I want someone who's already been where I want to go and I will follow them. And so I was thinking, well, if as an investor, I'm saying I want to have the opportunity to invest in organizations that are doing good and making money, and I'm not seeing anyone actually building up those opportunities for me, if we're going to start this organization, it has to have a sustainable business model because otherwise that makes no sense. And everyone said you couldn't do it, but I did. And it's still going today. The woman who was my deputy CEO is now the CEO, and they're doing incredible things in the world. And that was a really exciting piece, and again, a common theme for me of I actually like it when people say you can't do something, and it gives me more determination to prove you can. So
I love that.
Yeah. So there's sort of that side of things. Then I, with my business partner, also then founded an organization that was further down the track of once those organizations became investable, how do we structure the deals, bring in the right mix of philanthropy and impact investors to invest in those organizations, which again built up to a 7-figure business. And in all of that, I suppose the piece that people would see and that is apparent in the way that I interact is that I'm very determined and work really hard, but that also kind of the magic, if you like, is the ability to be engaged with and understand the system level. So I have direct appointments from federal government here with advisory work I do with different departments across the government, down to working directly one-on-one with a founder of a business who might be in a Pacific island somewhere, and I understand how their coconut farm works and have been on the truck out in the middle of nowhere and sat down with farmers. And so bridging those two worlds, I think, is one of the unique pieces that certainly helps me be taken seriously and engaged across that system, because if people at a systems level don't understand the grassroots, what happens is we create academic responses to things that often don't work. And so I kind of bring in that ability to know what it takes and what it's like to be the founder and someone running the business. But I also understand all of the complexity that goes in through my work with governments, really large funding bodies, the United Nations and others, that means that I can be pragmatic and kind of see where, okay, we're going to have to come up and design a different intervention here. So that's sort of the common theme, the serial entrepreneur. I'm an impact investor, actively engage with investing in and funding projects and businesses that I think are going to change the world. And yeah, that's probably sums me up.
Oh, I love that, Bessie. Thanks for I like learned stuff while you talked about what you've done. So that was awesome. Oh, so good. Okay, well, let's get right to the heart here. Of course, the intention as I hold these Chronicle interviews is really for a peek behind the curtain. We could hold an interview about the how-tos of building these 7-figure businesses, but this is more about like what has happened in your heart and what it's taken, and it's my hope that other women will watch this, women who are 7+ figure business owners will watch this and feel like, wow, me too. Like, I'm not alone, because that's very common. And then of course that the rest of us will be inspired and will kind of, take heart and be able to change the narrative for the next wave of female business owners who are really successful. So let's just jump in there. One of the things that you said, kind of surprised you was what success would ask you to sacrifice.
Yeah. It's interesting because often there's components. You talked about the loneliness of people feeling isolated, or am I the only person going through this? And I think one of the pieces that is connected to that, in terms of things that you would have to give up or lose, or what does it cost you, is that, like anything in life, the people that mean the most to you or that you love the most can therefore be the people who hurt you the most, because it actually is important to you. And in amongst the components of leading and pushing into new territory and really pioneering different components of what people didn't think, or still don't think in many cases, is possible, I had cultivated around me, there was, a number of people who I very much not only admired, I thought that they were incredibly gifted in their own spaces, but who I came to deeply hold as friends that I loved, that were really close to me in that space. And over time, that experience of multiple times over having getting to a certain place where either there was no longer alignment and I didn't actually feel I could trust someone, or there wasn't integrity in how the interactions were progressing, felt like this really, there was grief connected to in the process of that, having to let go of, and in some cases not even having the choice to let go of, but losing friendships that were quite dear to me through that experience of, I'm someone who very much in my work with entrepreneurs, with other leaders, and in my own life, am very clear on what my values are. And I like to stay in alignment with those. And I like to have, integrity in how I interact. And so the point where you get to a place where there is no longer alignment with someone who you love dearly is quite a tricky one. And I can genuinely say that multiple times over, particularly in the last sort of 12 years, that experience of having to grapple with the decision to disconnect from someone, or to experience what it's like when they make an action or interact in a way that actually just, cuts that relationship off. That's been really tricky, to combine that with not only the intensity of what is already a lonely path, but to feel that. And so, I mean, feel free to dig in around that if there's particular aspects, but that has, from a theme, that loss of those that you actually really consider deep friends has been a difficult one for me.
And I've heard that so often, and it's something that I speak to fairly often as well, because it really is so pertinent. I think it happens so often. And then the part maybe that makes it even trickier is that no one's like pointing the finger at you and saying like, we hate you because you're growing so much. Like it would be a lot easier if they would just be honest, right? But like that's way too honest. Instead, it's like, well, you're a bad friend, or there's just like the judgments, and they make it personal, and it's like, and it takes a lot of inner knowing to be able to separate and go, oh no, this is actually what's happening. Like,
and also to accept really that fact of, I'm not sure about you, but I'm very good at projecting. So I think, well, if that was me, I would have reflected on, this has happened. And it's like, not everyone is having that self-awareness or reflecting in that way. And I have zero control over getting that other person to engage with me in the way that I would want them to. So it's kind of this dance I find between the rationally trying to work through like, well, this doesn't make sense. Like we can fix this. And I'm the queen of give me a problem and I'll try and fix it. So often in that, I will later look back and go, oh, I have a very strong pattern here of waiting too long because I'm convinced I can fix it. So I was saying to my husband the other day that in one of the interactions I had, I was like, it's interesting. Do you remember I told you, X months before this all blew up that I was not comfortable anymore, and I didn't actually trust. There was something had shifted in that relationship, and I should have acted on that, but I thought I could fix it. And I think that piece is often apparent for me, that as someone who does set, big goals, and like I said before, I love it when someone says, I think that's not going to work. My husband once got me a T-shirt that on the back said, "Don't believe me, just watch." And I said it had to be on the back of the shirt because they would be behind me. But while I love that, it's that old thing of our strengths are our weaknesses. The pieces that help me drive through and push where others would give up also mean I end up getting hurt more, and I hold on too long, and I think I can fix it.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then it ties into this loneliness piece that you've touched on a bit. One of the patterns, and I'm curious if you've seen this play out for you, that I've seen is that, so you go along your way, you're carving out success for yourself. All of a sudden there's a random, like a target on your back. And now you have people who are hurting you deliberately or unintentionally. And it's very clear you have to like sever those relationships. And then that does something. I think it's very common at that time to then start to kind of put up these walls and feel like I can't really show people what's going on with me. Like if I give an inch, people will take a mile, and prevents us from then feeling like there's support when we go through other hard things. Has that been true for you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's also another piece that's connected to that, which is in amongst the swirl of that loneliness or grief or what you're letting go of. One of the bits that I've found over and over again that's difficult to pull apart is when that happens, usually there's not just one thing going on. And so it's hard to go, oh, am I feeling this because this relationship broke down? Or am I feeling this because I'm under a lot of pressure at the moment and there's these other 15 pieces going on? And so it's the pulling apart of what you're feeling about distinct things, because I think it's quite human for us to, whatever we happen to be focusing on, then all the intensity and emotion that's going on related to everything gets focused in on that. Mm-hmm. And we don't necessarily go, oh, I'm either obsessing over this, trying to win this particular contract at work, but it's actually because I'm feeling the loss of my friend over here, or I'm, so what is actually going on inside you? And for me, that comes up again and again around the aspect that we have to accept that we are multidimensional and there's lots of different pieces going on. Because the more we can be comfortable in that, and a little bit like we spoke about at the beginning before we came on, there's this aspect of if we don't first sit very comfortably in the fact that we already have track record, we're already established, you are successful in the way that the world sees that, and you add value. If you don't already sit comfortably in that and not have this desperate need for people to know that and acknowledge that, until that calm is on you, it's very difficult to then be vulnerable enough to admit the components where you go, wow, I am really struggling with this. And that doesn't mean that I'm not capable. That doesn't mean that I'm not incredibly strong and determined and resilient, but it means that in the in this moment, in this experience, I'm finding this difficult. And so I do think that that acceptance that we are more than one thing, and that we have already acknowledged and owned, and not even just owned, but that we honor our own brilliance and what we bring into the world, that is a really critical first step to be able to step into the level of vulnerability to go, yeah, I don't have this all figured out. And in fact, that's the most beautiful thing. Like, I've had clients where we've done, say, engagement surveys and things afterwards. And one of the pieces that I love seeing is when people say, oh, I liked working with Bessi because she didn't pretend she had it all together. Like, I liked that, you don't have to have all the answers. And in fact, in my opinion, when you're trying to work in very complex, big systems, for example, the quicker you admit that and you get good at going, who's needed for what part of this puzzle and how do I bring their brilliance into the mix, the more impactful you will be in the world. Because if you think you're the answer, you could not possibly have the diversity of skills and experience that's going to be required to address any complex problem. So that is all part of that journey as well. But for me, related to, your initial piece around that loneliness, whenever I don't feel able to admit sadness or loss, or that I am feeling, almost that sense of you've been abandoned. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm out here exposed. If that's not feeling like something that you can admit to or sit in, then chances are there's still some aspects around accepting the broader, fuller sense of who you are, and particularly the honoring of your brilliance.
Oh, I really, really love that connection that you're making between those two things. It's because we're not compartmentalized. So I just love that. You had shared before we came live that you have had a journey of some grieving and loss, and at many times that has felt really lonely. Do you want to go into that at all?
Yeah, one of the pieces that I had mentioned to you around that. So again, if you live long enough, all of us have different experiences. You're not going to have a smooth ride the whole time through your life. But I've found, and one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately, are those areas where there has been grief or trauma or loss, but for whatever reason, there's a component of it that means it's not really validated or visible to other people. So you struggle to, if it's quite apparent what the trauma is, then people expect you to struggle or will give you more room or care for you and look after you in a different way. But the pieces in my life that have been tricky, one of them, for example, was around when I was 8, my dad had a massive brain injury, which meant that literally for the rest of my childhood, he was not functioning and not the same person. And, I didn't feel like I actually had a dad in that space. Incredibly now, so this week was actually 34 years since his, the fall, as we call it. And he is far more my dad now than he was then. He still has, obviously, consequences of that brain injury, but the brain is an amazing thing of how over time it can heal itself. But during my childhood, there was that really difficult thing of, it was confusing because I couldn't grieve my dad because he was physically still there. So it's like I didn't lose my dad. He didn't die. He was there, but he wasn't. And so I think those types of experiences where you then learn, particularly as a young child. So my mum was really sick from when I was 6, and then when I was 8, my dad had a brain injury that, as I said, was very serious. And what that means is that I suspect it was already in me, but certainly from that very young age, there was no one to fix things or sort things out for you. You learnt to go, okay, there's a problem, it's on me to fix it, which means it sort of embeds that independence and sense of like, I will be the person to sort things out because there is no one else to do it. It was, we always say, even though I'm one of 4 girls, it was every man for himself in our house. It was like, sort yourself out. Because, there wasn't another option. But that piece of not really knowing how you could express or deal with or process the loss and grief was quite interesting. And there are multiple components of that then played out for me as an adult. So, I've had a job since I was 10. I've always been very independent. I've looked after myself financially and done all of those things from a young age. And I remember being in New York as an adult, and I was staying at this beautiful Airbnb, and there wasn't any shampoo. So I went down to buy some shampoo, and I'd picked shampoo based on the smell. So I had flicked the bottle open of a bottle of Pantene, and I smelt it and I started crying. And I was like, oh, what on earth is that about? And when I thought through it, I always wanted Pantene when I was a kid, because I had a friend who had Pantene at their house, but we didn't have Pantene. And it was this hilarious thing of the association of that I had wanted things that were not an option, and how, that interesting. I don't know if you've read The Body Keeps Score, but it's like this aspect of
So true.
how sensations or there's just things that are locked up in your body. And it was interesting because I hadn't felt that sense of deprivation or anything at the time. I wasn't conscious of it. But the fact that, all these years later, I smelt Pantene and started crying, it was like, oh, interesting, there's something there. So I think that aspect of the grief that is not as apparent to the world or easy to deal with. And, we all have versions of that. I'm sure there'll be many women who have lost babies. I had the experience of, it took me 5 pregnancies to have my 2 boys. And lost multiple babies, and some in really intense situations. And that piece of trying to figure out, how do you grieve a child you never actually knew? So I would downplay and kind of say, oh, well, it's not as bad as someone who loses a child who's, 5 years old, or where they've known that child. And so you kind of don't want to seem like you're taking up or edging into someone else's grief that surely is worse than yours. That piece is difficult, because it's like, oh, what is this loss? And how do you process that? So I think for me, the aspects that I'm really looking at the moment are the grief and loss for me that was more difficult to process, because it wasn't as visible and public.
And then you add to the fact that because society does that. Society is who says there is no space for the grieving woman, and or I guess grief in general, whether you're a man or a woman. And so it's I think then it's magnified when you're trying to run business and stuff as well. I have to be the face. I have to be on. There's no space for emotion, when really our grief and our loss calls us to deeper parts of ourselves. We always find power and depth, as I'm sure you've experienced. But it's a shame that we feel that just leads to that deeper feeling of isolation.
Yeah. And in some ways, if you want to take that aspect of some of the components of your life more broadly and bring them into your business, that to me is no different to the work that I've done over many years with organizations, and particularly with leaders or those who have significant wealth. Because the aspect of, in my mind, what creates that really fulfilling, aligned sense of creating a legacy is that you want to be able to see the common theme between all of your work. And so to actually not see things as compartmentalized, and this is my life, and this is where I lost children, and this is where I had difficulties, or this is where, I got divorced, or whatever your story is, finding ways to actually thread those through so that your whole story makes sense is actually really powerful. And I think it draws people to you, and it gives you energy and makes you actually feel connected to your work in a more holistic way. So for me, one of the old phrases I always use is the aspect of time, talent, and treasure. So how are you using those things? And in my mind, part of what is your own brilliance that you bring into that is your life experience. So if you keep, obviously some things are private, but if you keep all aspects of your personal life separate to your work, it's actually very difficult for a customer or an investor or someone to feel a connection with you. And that's really what you need in order to sustain those big, long time frames where change occurs. So I think actually working through that and saying, okay, what is the theme between how I actually use my time? Is that I do a whole lot of volunteer work related to my kids and sport? Okay, that's interesting. Where is it that I'm using my talent? And what's the common connection there? And how am I using my treasure in terms of both what I give away and how I invest? Because we can, and as really established leaders and successful women entrepreneurs out there in the world, chances are you're strategic, right? Chances are you run scenarios and you plan things out. So actually look at your life in that way and draw together those pieces so that the way you invest is not completely at odds with the way you're spending your time and volunteering. Like, there should be connections there. And doing that work, in my mind, is the aspect that helps us come closer to the chance of actually, when we look back and we have a sense of legacy, that we will actually feel fulfilled and not go, did I put in all that effort for things that actually I don't really care about?
Absolutely beautiful. Gosh, thanks for sharing this. As we bring this interview to a close, I always love to ask one final question, which is, tell us, and this is just an opportunity again for us to see your heart, Bessi. Tell us about a time that was one of the most fulfilling experiences you've had in your life.
Okay. It's an interesting one, again, because that whole fulfillment piece is something I am really curious about and always trying to unpack. And I think for me, there would probably be a few different stories, but the theme around when I feel fulfilled is that aspect of the moments where I know that I have actually unlocked how someone thinks and opened the world up to them in a different way, or really shifted an outcome that they've been able to achieve. So I see my work as being, I don't have my own particular thematic other than the doing good and making money umbrella, but it's about unlocking in someone else what is going to be most life-giving for them. So two of the stories that come to mind that will probably seem quite random, but in the moment they felt divine for me, were in one organisation that I was working with, where we were working on their business model and trying to help them figure out what would the sustainable business model be. It ended up that as we understood where this person was at and the complexity of their personal life at that time, we actually advised them that now was not the time for them to proceed with that business and they shouldn't do it. And it seems funny because you would think, like, so then that means they're now not going to pay us to do that work. But it was the most beautiful thing because it completely relieved the pressure of their assumption was that we would be saying, yes, power on, do it. And in fact, it was not the right thing at that time for them. And by letting go of that, it opened up their ability to deal with and engage with the complexity of their family at that time in a beautiful way. And the other story that, again, is interestingly in that aspect of telling someone not to proceed with something was with philanthropists who had wanted to fund this project quite considerably and had asked us to come in and really triage and assess the business model. Was it a good use of grant funding to support this organisation? And if they were going to support it, they would be paying us significant money to build the capacity of it. But again, when we got in there and looked at it, our advice to them was, no, you shouldn't fund this and don't proceed. And they were genuinely shocked and said to me, I can't believe you're not telling us to go ahead with this when you would get paid in the process. And so that beautiful alignment for me of being able to be someone who, I will tell it like it is, I'm not going to proceed with something if we shouldn't, but opening people's minds up to look at something from a different perspective. And ultimately, I want to see people's time, talent, and treasure having really positive impacts in the world. And if something isn't aligned or the timing's not right, for me, the most fulfilling moments are helping them figure that out so that they can actually live in a more aligned space and actually create more impact in the end.
Love that. Thanks so much for all that you've shared. Is there any last pieces that you would like to share before we go?
Probably just, again, that reminder of the foundational aspect being around the more we know and honor ourselves, the more we're able to then live out in our life in that fulfilling way. So just encouraging people to do that work and really come to that place of peace and calm in themselves, not just focusing out on all the incredible things that you're doing in the world.
I love that. Thank you again, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to go check out Bessi's podcast. There's a link in the description, and go follow her. You know, if you resonated with what she shared, it's a gift to have heard the things that you shared today, and thanks for being willing to share some of the trickier parts that no one's asking you about. All
Thank
right,
you so much,
guys.
Melisa.
Bye-bye.